Good morning, everybody. We are glad that you're here this morning. We especially want to welcome our visitors. I know we have several visitors that are still with us, several of Vince's family and friends that had come in yesterday for Doty's memorial, and we're glad you're able to be here with us this morning. We have others that are just in the area vacationing, and then others just from our community. Whatever your situation is, we're just glad you're here. We know that you have choices about where to worship and how to spend your time, and we're glad that you chose to be with us today. A few years ago, I came across a blog post on a website, and the title of the blog was The Kindness Experiment. And the premise of the blog was simply this: the world is full of people that are hurting, and would showing kindness actually make a difference? Now, this wasn't any type of scientific experiment. The results of any information that was gathered would never be published in any type of medical journal. This was simply an individual that had an idea because he looked out and saw a world of people that were hurting, people that were being bullied, people that felt unloved, people that were just struggling and suffering with the burdens of life, and as a result, maybe we're dealing with depression or other types of physical or mental ailments that just cause their lives trouble. And so the question was posed, does showing kindness actually make a difference in the lives of individuals that are suffering? So here was the challenge of the author of the blog that he presented. For one day, take the focus off of ourselves and the struggles that we might be engaged in, and just look up around us at other people, at what they might be struggling with. And then, after you've done that, take one day and dedicate that one day to showing kindness to people around you. Maybe sit down at the table at lunch with that person that's sitting by themselves. Maybe think about that friend that you know is going through a difficult time, and pick up the phone and make a phone call and spend 5 minutes just talking with that individual. Maybe hug your spouse in the morning. Yes, that's actually kindness, right? Maybe think about that person that you need to extend forgiveness to in your life. Maybe ask your coworker, how's your day going? And then pause and truly listen. You see, there are any number of ways that we can engage in kindness with those that we come in contact with people we know, with people that we don't know. But I find it fascinating, the whole premise behind this individual's idea in his blog. Does showing kindness make a difference in the lives of people? And as I thought about the blog and just some of the responses as I read through them, I kind of paused and I thought for a moment, this experiment's already been done and we know the outcome. I think all of us here this morning would agree that kindness is important in life. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22, as we would read about the fruit of the Spirit, we would find kindness right in the midst of the elements that make up that fruit. If we were to turn in our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and start reading about love, when we come to verse 4, we would find that love is kind. You see, love is part of the very nature of God. And because kindness is part of the very nature of God. And because you and I are made in God's image, then kindness is a part of the DNA that God has stamped us with and put inside of us. So what does it look like, though, in action? It's easy to just jot down those ideas that I referenced from that blog post, but when you really think about our lives and what we are aspiring to be like, more importantly, who we are aspiring to be like, we look to Jesus for every aspect of our lives as the perfect example, and kindness is no exception. This morning, I want to take us to a story that many of you might be familiar with. You can go ahead and start opening your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. We're going to read about Jesus, a man, and a bed. And we're going to look at this story through maybe a different lens than you might have looked at it before. We're going to see if there aren't some lessons from this particular event in Jesus' life that might shed some light on kindness for you and me. what kindness looks like in our life, what it looked like in Jesus' life, what it looked like in the individuals that were present as Jesus healed this man on that given day. Let's go to Mark chapter 2. And in this story, I want us to notice a couple of things and then maybe make some observations together. The first thing I want us to notice is this. I want us to notice some helpful friends. Let's just start reading together, and we'll notice the scene that unfolds before us. And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. Now let's just stop in verse 1, and we're going to take a little bit of time to get through these verses. Jesus has returned to Capernaum. Flip back maybe a page in your Bibles to just the first chapter in Mark. You see, Jesus has begun His ministry. We read about the temptation of Jesus in verses 12 through 14. And then beginning in verse 15, we could read about Jesus calling His first disciples to Him. And as He's gathered these first disciples, notice what happens in verse 21. They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath He entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at His teaching, for He taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And if we were to continue reading, we would read about one of the miracles of Jesus as He cleansed this man of an unclean spirit. But then notice, let's drop down to verse 29. And immediately He left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon, that's Peter, and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law would be ill with fever, and Jesus would heal her. And then notice verse 32. That evening at sundown, they brought to Him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And He healed many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons, and He would not permit the demons to speak because they knew Him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, He departed and went out to a desolate place, and there He prayed. And Simon and those who were with Him searched for Him, and they found Him, and they said to Him, "Everyone is looking for you." And He said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And He went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. You see, Jesus' ministry had started, and He already was being overwhelmed. I love the description here. The whole city was gathered together at the door of Simon Peter's house. Why? Because Jesus' reputation for kindness and compassion and concern for those that were in need had already spread throughout all of Capernaum. And as a result, Jesus physically was overwhelmed, so He departs out early that morning to get a break and to go and spend time in prayer, as was common for Him. And as His disciples start searching for Him, they find Him, and He says, "You know what? It's time to go." Things had gotten so overwhelming, and He had done His work there for the moment. He leaves, and they go throughout Galilee. But now, as we get to chapter 2, we find that He's returned to Capernaum. And I love what it says. He says He's at home. Who's home? Well, I don't guess we know definitively. I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say it wasn't His home. We know that Jesus didn't have a home in that sense. I think it's highly likely maybe they were back at Simon Peter's home. And we find Him at home. But as we keep reading, verse 2, it says, "Many were gathered together so that there were no more room, not even at the door. And He was preaching the word to them." To really appreciate this scene, we need to understand a little bit about Jewish culture and what would happen within a home. You see, our view of our homes and houses today and how we use them is really different than what would have happened in this particular home as Jesus was there. You see, as Jesus, let's assume that it was Simon Peter's home, as Jesus is in this home, what would have happened that morning is they simply would have opened the doors. And His word would have spread throughout town that Jesus was there. The doors were open as a symbol for people just to come, because you see, that's the community in which the Jews lived. Their home was simply an extension of the community in which they resided. And the doors were open from sun up to sundown. And people could come, and they had the ability to enter the home. And what we see unfolding before our eyes is not that much unfamiliar to what we had seen in chapter 1. People were coming. People wanted to hear. People wanted to know. And I find it interesting. What was Jesus doing? We don't read about Him healing here right now. We read about Him teaching the Word. Interesting phrase, isn't it? Just teaching the Word. What does that mean? Well, if we were to go to Paul's writings into 1 Corinthians, we could read about how Paul describes the Word as the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but that hasn't happened yet, has it? How did Jesus teach and preach as we look at the gospel accounts and as we think about His life? All the time, Jesus would go back to their scriptures, the Old Testament. And He might open the Torah, He might open from the Psalms, He might open from the prophets, and He would begin teaching them more deeply about God and His nature. Or maybe He would teach to them from the prophets the prophecies of the Messiah and how He was fulfilling those prophecies. But at the heart of everything He would teach, it was drawing the people back to God, their need for and dependence upon God, and how He was the answer for their deepest and most important need. And I believe that's what He would have been teaching here. Verse 3, "And they came bringing to Him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near Him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above Him, and when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, He said to the paralytic, 'Son, your sins are forgiven.'" As the scene continues to unfold, you witness the crowd. You can close your eyes. You can picture in your eyes this simple home with maybe front doors and back doors, and all the doors were open and the windows are open. And literally every opening to that house is filled with people. The doorways are full. The house is full. People are spilling out into the streets and the road. Faces are peering through the windows to the point that there's no room to get in. And all we read is they. You know, a lot of times we joke, the infamous they, right? Who are they? Because we'll joke about it because most of the time they are the ones complaining. But that's not what we find here. We find the friends of this paralytic. They're not named for us. We don't know how many there are. They're simply described as they. But from what we read, we see incredible kindness and concern for this paralytic. Number one, it took some amount of physical effort to get this paralyzed man to the very house. And then when they got there, we might say, in some ways, they were met with resistance. You see, the doorways were full. It wasn't easy for them to get to where they were trying to get to Jesus. They believed with all of their hearts the stories that they had heard. Maybe some of them had even witnessed the miracles that Jesus performed when He was in Capernaum the first time. They were convicted with everything in them that if they could get this paralyzed man to the very presence of Jesus, that was all that was needed to heal him. And they met roadblocks, they met obstacles, it took physical labor, but nothing was going to stop these group of friends from getting this paralyzed man to Jesus. And that's what they do. They come to the door, can't get through. No problem, they go to the roof, and you see their roof was a little different than what we might picture. Most of our roofs are pitched and have different aspects that would make it difficult to get up and walk, but the roofs that they would have had were flat, and many times they would even gather on the rooftops in the afternoon or the evening to sit. And there would have been maybe thatch roof where there was part of it that could be removed, maybe the first version of a sunroof, I don't really know, but they could take this off, and now there was the ability finally to get this paralyzed man down to Jesus. And so we see these helpful friends. We see their kindness displayed to this paralyzed man. We see their conviction and belief in Jesus and who He is and His capability. They didn't understand everything about Jesus. Maybe they only knew enough to know that there was hope for their friend. But whatever it was that they knew, it convicted them to do something. And we continue to see Jesus' kindness. You know, I think Jesus had used a home before as a place of respite and self-care for Himself. And I think maybe that's what His intention was, even as this scene unfolds. But you see, as was true in Jesus' life, His reputation preceded Him. And people longed for His presence because of what it meant to them, even when they didn't know their greatest need. But here's what we're going to find as we continue the story. We're going to see not only were there some helpful friends, but there were also some hostile foes. Let's pick back up in verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" You know, it's interesting. Simple description, but powerful. Jesus, it says, saw their faith. The faith of these individuals that brought the paralytic to him. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of times when we think of faith, we don't always think about it as something you can see. We think about it as something within us that is our personal conviction about who Jesus is or about who God is. But Mark records for us that when Jesus witnessed what these individuals were doing, he saw their faith. I think about Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. But whoever would come to God must believe that He is and that He rewards those who diligently seek Him. You see, faith is always exhibited by action. That's what defines faith. That's what measures faith. It's not something intellectually in our mind. It starts there, it germinates there, but you see it has to grow to something that leads an individual to do. And Jesus, it says, saw their faith. And I find it fascinating what Jesus' response. They came for healing, and Jesus provides it. But once again, Jesus sees the greatest need that an individual could ever have. He doesn't speak to his physical ailments. He speaks to the spiritual need, because ultimately that's Jesus' greatest concern. And he tells this man that's paralyzed, that came seeking the ability to walk, he says to him, your sins are forgiven. Well, some in the audience were scribes, and their ears perked up. And here was their logic. You see, they were trying to approach this logically, which there's nothing wrong with that. Their logic was this: only God can forgive sins. This man is not God, therefore he's blaspheming. He's slandering God, in essence, is what they were saying. Once again, we see Jesus' wisdom as Jesus' response to them. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Verse 8, and immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, "Why do you question these things in your hearts?" When Jesus said that to them, don't you think that should have sounded an alarm in their brain? It doesn't say that they said it. It says they thought it in their heart. And Jesus was able to see what was in their heart. You see, there's nothing wrong with being logical. It's good to be logical. The problem was their second premise was faulty. Only God can forgive sins. Jesus is God, therefore He can forgive sins. There was nothing wrong with trying to be logical, but the second premise was wrong. And so Jesus calls them out. He calls them out and He tells them what's in their hearts. And that should have stopped them dead in their tracks, but it doesn't. You see, it's important to understand a little bit about the history of the scribes. They started out maybe what you and I might describe as secretaries to some degree. They were keepers, records of what would happen in the king's court. They would record the decrees of the king so that there was a historical record. But by the time Ezra came on the scene, their role started to gain in importance and prominence, and they really developed into experts of the law. And by the time we get to Jesus, they had really lost their focus. You see, it was more about wielding their power. They held an important place in the Sanhedrin many times, the high court, we might say. And they had become a burden to the people and made life more difficult than it needed to be. And so Jesus poses an important question to them. He says, "Why do you question these things in your heart?" And then verse 9, which is easier to say to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk"? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Which one's easier? Is it easier just to simply say your sins are forgiven, or is it easier to say, take up your bed, arise and walk? I guess it depends maybe on your perspective, doesn't it? You see, it's easier, I guess in some ways, to say your sins are forgiven because who can know if they are or if they aren't? There's really no way to measure that, is there, other than God and His wisdom. From their perspective, it's much harder to say, get up and walk, because there's a visual evidence of it, isn't there? So Jesus is going to prove them wrong on both points. So Jesus says this in verse 10, but that you may know that the Son of God has authority on earth to forgive sins. You see, He's going back to their faulty second principle, isn't He? They knew that only God could forgive sins, but they didn't believe He was God. So Jesus, in essence, is going to say, let me prove to you where you made your mistake. Verse 11, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home. And he rose and immediately picked up his bed, went out before them all, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw anything like this. You see, Jesus, through this miracle, He does a multitude of things. He shows kindness to this paralyzed man. In some ways, He shows kindness to those that brought him, because He's meeting the very thing that they were seeking for their friend. But He goes beyond what they thought they needed to give him even more than he knew he needed or could imagine. And in doing so, He's trying at least to help the scribes see, you're missing who I really am. I'm the very one you've been seeking all along. And the miracle was instantaneous. You think about, many of you in this room have gone through injuries in your life. Maybe you've had surgery, or you've had something happen to a limb on your body. And maybe you are without use of that limb or extremity for a long period of time. What happens at the end as the healing process is complete? Usually what happens, you engage in some type of therapy, don't you? Why? Because you got to relearn some things, don't you? Your muscles atrophy. Your muscle memory maybe fades. And so you'll go through a series of therapy to learn how to regain proper function and use of whatever that limb is. This man's been paralyzed. And guess what? He didn't need physical therapy. He didn't have to learn how to walk again. He immediately got up, picked up his bed, and went out before all of them, to the point that they were all left saying, we've never in all of our lives seen anything like this before. You see, that's the nature of Jesus' healing. That's the nature of the power of God in flesh on earth, to help His audience see it's not just their physical need, but to answer His question, it's much more difficult to forgive sins, because that can only come from God, and I am God, and I'm here to meet your greatest need. Now let's close with this thought. Some humbling facts that relate to kindness. And we'll share several, and I don't pretend that these are all-encompassing of the story we just read, but let's start with this one. Kindness involves the home. I find it interesting that Mark chooses to start this story by simply describing it was reported that he was at home. He could have simply said it was reported that he was back in the area. It was reported that he was in this general location, but he's specific enough to say it was reported that he was at home. And I think kindness involves the home in a couple different ways. Jesus used the home for self-care, to get away sometime from the crowds, to use it as an opportunity to heal Himself so that He was ready to help other people. I think maybe that's something important for us to remember. It's okay for us to use our homes for self-care, to take care of ourselves so we can get back to taking care of others and fulfilling Jesus' mission. But I also think it's fascinating, and I think there's a lot we can learn from Jewish culture about how they use their home as a means of kindness. I love the picture that at sunup the doors would open, indicating that our home is open because we are part of community. You know, they didn't use their homes to shut the blinds and shut the doors and use it as a fortress to shield themselves from everything out in the world so that they didn't engage. They recognized that they lived in community, and their home was an extension of that community. And it was used as a way to bless other people. I think about Romans chapter 12, when Paul would begin talking about What is our responsibility to each other? And one of those pieces of responsibility is that we are to show hospitality, a love for strangers. And in the culture of Jews, that involved their home. And I think there's an aspect where kindness involves the home. It shows that we're open. It shows that we care. It shows that we're willing to share. And it shows that we live beyond ourselves and we are part of a greater community. Kindness also involves how we see people. I think about those that were in the doorway of that home. And the fact that here's this man that's paralyzed being carried by his friends. And I guess maybe I'm assuming some things here, but as I read the story, what I picture is people that were so wrapped up in what they were hearing, or maybe even their own needs, that they failed to see what was happening around them. They failed to see the paralyzed man, and maybe that his need was even greater than their own need. Some of them were there just to listen. They didn't have physical needs. They were just interested in listening. But sometimes all of us we can become so focused on what's happening in our own lives that we fail to see anything that's happening around us. Go back to that kindness experiment with me. That was part of the premise, wasn't it? Take our focus off of ourselves just for one day to see what's happening around us in the lives of other people. That was maybe one of the greatest gifts that Jesus left through His example for us, was His ability to see the needs of other people. And Jesus always looked a little bit deeper when it came to those needs, didn't He? He didn't just look at the surface level. He got into the ugly. He got into the messy. He went where most other people in society didn't want to go. He dealt with those that were outcast, that were hurting, because He lifted up His eyes to see what was happening in the lives of other people. And kindness involves how we see people. Seeing more than a man or a woman. Seeing more than race or socioeconomic status. I guess maybe the most important part is seeing souls. Seeing the spiritual need that only Jesus can fulfill, in the same way that He saw that spiritual need in the life of this paralytic. Kindness involves meeting needs. Jesus always took the time to meet people's needs. He cared about people. Kindness involves friendships. I think about those friends that brought the paralyzed man. Their names aren't recorded. But how would the story have been different if it weren't for those people that brought this man? We're all blessed with people in our lives that are friends. And kindness involves us allowing people into our lives and getting involved in other people's lives so that we develop these friendships. Hey, John, I might need you to hit that for me. It's not clicking, if you don't mind. Thank you. Kindness involves faith. You see, that's really what Jesus cares about, is developing our faith. And these men that brought this paralytic, these friends and the paralytic, they believed with everything in them that Jesus had the ability to meet their need. Sometimes it's easy to get skeptical about people, isn't it? It's easy to look at people and see the worst and not have faith that most people are genuinely good. We need to have faith sometimes, don't we? That if we do the right thing, that regardless of how it's received, regardless of what happens in our lives or how other people might perceive us, that something good will ultimately come out of it because God has the ability to make good. Kindness involves leading people to Jesus. That's really the ultimate act of kindness, isn't it? We can meet physical needs in a lot of different ways, but the ultimate, most important aspect of our concern and compassion to other people is leading them to Jesus. Kindness involves obstacles too. This paralytic, he encountered obstacles along the way, didn't he? Jesus encountered obstacles from the Scribes. And sometimes as we demonstrate kindness, we're going to face obstacles. We may face opposition, we may face anger even. But it didn't stop Jesus, it didn't stop the paralytic, and it can't stop us. And then ultimately, kindness involves glorifying God. That was Jesus' whole purpose, wasn't it? Jesus' purpose was to point people back to God. Through His actions, through His miracles, through His life and example, He was pointing people back to the Father because His role was for people to see God in flesh. And ultimately, as you and I show kindness, it's nothing about what we get out of it. It's not about our ego. It's not anything about us personally. It's about how we, as image bearers of God, can glorify God to others through our own lives and through our own actions. It's an interesting story here in Mark chapter 2, and maybe on the surface, it doesn't seem like it has much to do with kindness at all. In fact, the word kindness is not even found anywhere in the text. But I think as we dig a little bit deeper, we can see kindness throughout the whole story. And as you and I are here this morning, you and I are trying to live like Jesus in our lives today. And at the heart of who we need to be individually and collectively and as a community is we need to be people that show kindness to each other, to strangers, to our community, because what we want is for people to see Jesus in us. It's a challenge for all of us this week. Maybe we enact our own kindness experiment. What can we do this week to live out kindness in our lives to those that we come in contact with? I hope we'll all think about it and maybe look for opportunities to be more kind or to begin showing kindness in our lives. We're here this morning, and this morning it's all about Jesus and the cross and our relationship with Him. If you're here this morning and you want to know more about Jesus, we'd love to share Him with you. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have. We'll be happy to walk beside you. And if you're here this morning and you're hurting or suffering in any way, we are a family of God's people. And His purpose for us being a community is that we can encourage and walk beside each other and put our arm around each other because we are all in this journey of faith together. If you need our encouragement, if there's anything we can do to serve you this morning, won't you let us know now while together we stand and sing.